Hello and welcome to the Wish You Knew podcast. I'm your host, Karen Bortvet. Thank you so much for taking the time to tune in again this week. Before we jump into the interview that we have planned for you today, I want to give a shout out to the lovely Laura Mock, who did the logo design for the Wish You Knew podcast. I realized last week that we've done 3 episodes and haven't given her a shout out. So if you're looking for a graphic designer to work with, you can check out Laura's work at lauramock.design. And like I said, she's the one that did that great logo that you see every time you click on the podcast. So thank you very much to Laura. This week we have an interview with 2 friends of mine, Melissa and Pete, who lost their house to Hurricane Sandy. This is the 5th year anniversary of Hurricane Sandy later this month in October. So we wanted to do something in remembrance of that, and also with all of the natural and man-made disasters in the news these days, for many of us, we've never experienced that. So we thought it was a good time to talk with someone who has been through that experience so we can all learn from that experience and how to better support people who are going through such an experience as that. Hope you enjoy the show. So let's get started with Pete and Melissa. Pete and Melissa, thanks so much for being on the show. I appreciate you taking the time to talk with us today.
Thanks for having us.
We have a bunch of different questions today. Some of these are questions that I've come up with, and others are questions that were submitted by our listeners who are eager to learn from your experiences. For those who have read your bio, we learned that you lost your house to Hurricane Sandy 5 years ago. The first question is to help all of us understand the state you're in or what goes through your mind when you hear that a hurricane is coming toward your house. Do you remember what was running through your head when you heard the hurricane was coming towards where you lived?
That's a really interesting question, Karen. Yeah, to go back a little bit, the year before Sandy hit, there was a Hurricane Irene, that the forecasters had predicted was going to make landfall in Long Beach, Long Island, where we were living. And so we and the rest of the community packed up everything. We moved our TV to upstairs. We put our furniture on blocks. We did everything we could to protect the house, and we followed the suggestion that had been issued to evacuate. And Hurricane Irene ended up coming in with a whimper and was nothing more than a glorified rainstorm when it actually made landfall not too far from where we were living. And so when we heard about Sandy, not just Melissa and I, but I think our whole community kind of groaned and said, oh, here we go again. They're telling us that this hurricane is going to hit, that there's going to be these effects. But I don't think anybody really believed it. There was a little bit of the boy who cried wolf thing going on. And so, interestingly, we took a lot less precautions to protect our house and our belongings from the hurricane that ended up really turning our lives upside down.
And it was kind of interesting. We kept hearing about the news. I was like, oh, should we evacuate? Should we stay? The last time, like Pete said, during Irene, our neighbors were making pancakes the morning after, and we were still, we were kind of stuck outside of our house, and it took us longer to get back with that. Oh, we don't really want to deal with that. But in the end, we decided, oh, what the heck? We'll probably be more comfortable if the power goes out. We had Evie at the time, who was 2 years old, I think. And Eli was at the time 5.5. We thought, oh, we'll go to my mother-in-law's house. It'll be more comfortable. So that was really what did it, is we thought, oh, well, it'll just be better to go somewhere else. It wasn't, I don't think either one of us was really thinking that it was going to be the one that was going to, turn everything upside down.
You mentioned moving your TV. Was that the one possession that you took the time to move out of harm's way?
I don't know. The story is that Pete was away with work for the week, and I was home alone with the 2 babies, and I kept hearing about Irene, and it's going to be bad. And to fill the to make myself busy while I was nervous, I did like Pete said, I packed up all kinds of things that I don't think were very important, but I moved them at the time. And then when actually Sandy was building up, I was working and busy, and I was just never even thought. And so the TV was downstairs with everything else.
You also mentioned prior to the storm seeing different announcements on TV about the storm coming. You said that was how you found out that maybe you should evacuate. Is that the only way that you're notified if you're living in an area that might be affected by a hurricane? Or how does that process work?
I believe that they had vehicles going around announcing that evacuation had been suggested and that everybody should leave. So I think there was also that. You know, the one thing about a hurricane that's different than, for example, an earthquake like we saw recently in Oaxaca, Mexico, is that there's a lot of notice. So you hear about it as soon as the computer models suggest that it might come anywhere near you. And so as the days build, there's also more and more information about preparations that you should take, and then ultimately about evacuation as well.
And I also signed up for it's like one of the things that the city had provided. It's like an emergency line. So it would send me text messages or voice messages. And it did end up sending us messages to say that this is a voluntary evacuation. And then when the computer said that it was going to be closer and there was much stronger of a likelihood that it would hit our city, then it turned to a mandatory evacuation. So I got those messages and texts from an automated system that the city had installed for anyone who signed up.
Had you been through any hurricane prior to Irene, or was that the first time for both of you to go through that whole process?
There had been hurricanes that had mildly affected Long Island in the past, but at that point I had been living in Long Beach for about 14 or 15 years, and there hadn't been anything consequential that had come through.
With the hurricanes, did you consider not evacuating, or did you have neighbors who chose not to evacuate?
That's a great question. Yeah, there was actually a lot of our neighbors who, because especially of Irene and the fact that they had left and nothing had happened, and the fact that what happened to our town was really unprecedented, they just said, you know what, we're gonna stay. We're not evacuating. You know, I'm just gonna wait it out. It'll be fine. It's not going to be a big deal. And then speaking to all those people a couple days later, to a person, they said, next time I'm going to evacuate, because they had the experience of looking out the window as the ocean filled the streets and the yards and everything in the community, rising higher and higher. And they didn't know, when it was going to stop. So it was really a harrowing and traumatic experience for the people who stayed.
It was kind of interesting because up until the days before, maybe like the weekend, a few days beforehand, with some people, there was an attitude of like, oh, you staying? Are you staying? Like there was going to be some sort of like badge of honor if you stayed through the hurricane. But for us, having the two little kids, like I said, there was no reason for us to be proud. At one point, Pete said, oh, I'm going to stay and you go. And I said, no, we're going to stay together. So we all went.
What factored in for most people when they were making that decision whether or not to evacuate, or what helped you to make that decision?
I think for a lot of people it was, I know one of our neighbors said, where am I going to go? I'm going to go to this person's house and inconvenience them. I don't want to do that. I don't want to go and be sleeping on somebody's couch for a night or two, So there was some of that, the inconvenience factor, and other people just really said, this is my house and I'm going to stay here, is what I saw. I don't know. What do you think, Pete?
Yeah, no, I think you captured it. I mean, there's people, I remember, and I think it was for Irene, where I said, no, you take the kids and go, I'm going to stay here with the house in case there's anything I can do. And Melissa started laughing at me, and she said, what are you possibly going to do to stop the hurricane from, damaging our house or affecting? And I came up completely empty. I had absolutely no idea of how I would be able to fight the forces of nature. I said, I guess you're right. And I packed a bag and went along with the rest of the family. And so when Sandy came, I had already come to grips with the fact that I was useless in the face of natural disasters. And so, packed up my stuff and went.
How did you decide what you were going to pack up when you left?
Oh, it was like we were going to a sleepover at my mother's. Like we were like, you know what? It was totally going through the motions with the expectation that we were going to come back the next day and, resume life and be inconvenienced by having to, unpack the few things that we might have packed up to take with us. But we had no sense that we were, in for what we were in for.
Yeah, I mean, I think whenever we went back after, I think if I would have really been thinking like, oh, this is the big one again, I would have, picked up photo albums, things that I cannot replace now, that I just didn't think of because, like Pete said, we just didn't have it on our radar, and maybe other people did and we didn't, but I don't know. We brought nothing important really to Pete's mom's house.
You said you packed up as if you were just going to be gone overnight. How long did it end up being before you could return to your home?
It was a full month before we were able to spend a considerable amount of time in the house. Within a few days, we were able to come back to, start throwing away pretty much everything that was on the first floor. Everything from appliances to tearing out the rugs to throwing away the furniture to books. So we were able to do that, but the whole first floor had been filled about 2.5 or 3 feet with ocean water, and so even to sleep upstairs, we had to make sure that the house was sufficiently dry, that there wasn't any risk of mold having spread, and so there was a lot that had to be done before we could spend a considerable amount of time in the house.
And we also didn't have power for the first 8 or 9 days after. A bunch of New York City didn't have power. And it also was November, so it started to actually get pretty cold. And so we were trying to gut out the house while it was starting to be pretty cold outside.
I want to talk more about when you went back to your house for the first time, but before that, I want to jump back a little bit further. Do you remember what you were thinking when you were at your mother's house, hearing that the storm was setting in, or as the storm was coming?
I think it was still like denial, like, oh yeah, I remember from Irene. And then Pete actually had the radio on, like the local news station. So it was probably like in the middle of the night, every once in a while, I'd kind of like wake up and hear like, oh, the water or it's raining really hard. Now it's hitting X area or whatever. So I remember kind of like that. But I think I was just still sort of in denial that I just kind of was like, okay, it's going to be fine. Like, we're just going to go back and it's just we'll find out more what's going on in the morning. So I was still kind of in denial, I suppose.
And by the time the morning came, the electricity was out. And so you would hear some reports, or if someone had a wireless device that still had battery, you might be able to, get on a web page to read a little bit. But you knew it was way more serious than we had anticipated. But the scale was still unknown until we actually had the opportunity to go back and see what had become of our town.
Yeah, I think Pete's absolutely correct. I think it started to kind of sink in a little bit that Long Beach had hit when we finally got onto like social media, like Facebook, and there was pages going up saying, my mother lives on Riverside and I haven't had contact with her. Someone, and people were just starting to exchange names of people, and they were looking for people, and they were saying flooding on this block and this block is bad and sand here. And so once you started to see those things, and even though I didn't see our street on those different social media, like Facebook pages and such, I still thought, oh man, that's like 2 blocks away. That's 3 blocks away. And so that's when it kind of started to sink in that, oh, our house